As people start to file in, I wanted to take a moment to go through some housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on peoplefluent.com. All attendees have been placed on mute, so if you have a question for the presenters or are having technical difficulties, please submit your questions in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. And our presenters will be answering questions at the end of their presentation. And with that, I'm excited to introduce today's presenters. Our first presenter is Steve Goldberg. Steve has 30 years on all sides of HR and HR technology with experience as a global practitioner, vendor products executive, and advisor to HR executives and vendors through his own advisory practice. He's considered a top-tier human capital management industry analyst and has also served in this capacity at Burson & Associates back in 2011. In 2017, he joined Ventana Research to lead Ventana's human capital management research and advisory services. Specific to compensation management, Steve has personally designed, automated, and ran compensation processes at premier banks and financial services organizations. He holds an MBA in human resources and is a frequent speaker at industry events and has been widely published as well. Our second presenter is Tom Sykes. Tom is a human capital management enterprise software professional with over 20 years of experience in product design, development, implementation, and sales and marketing. He has a specific focus on financial systems and talent management applications, including compensation management. As PeopleFluent's Director of Product Management and Product Marketing, he designs and directs the product strategy for PeopleFluent's entire suite of integrated talent management solutions. He earned a bachelor's degree in finance from California Polytechnic State University, and he is a frequent contributing author and speaker for industry events and webinars. And with that, let me hand the floor over to Steve.
Hey, thanks a lot, Rachel, and thanks for joining everyone. So as far as the flow of this talk, it's basically centered around 4 sections. You kind of get a preview here of the first section. So we'll start off with some context around what we see in a typical CHRO agenda and how it relates to compensation management as well. I'll also get into some, let's say, framework around talent management and comp management and how they have been evolving. I'll also share some additional context around my employee experience framework, which definitely has relevance to compensation and rewards management. For part 2, you'll see some relevant research from Ventana Research's comp management benchmark research of hundreds of comp and HR professionals. And then I'll give my point of view on a few of the most important new themes in comp management and cover them from both a what and a how perspective, what it is and how technology can enable it. And finally, in part 4, we'll conclude with some recommendations, including recommendations in regards to crafting a winning business case for bringing in new comp management tools. So with that, and like Rachel said, we'll also take some questions at the end. As far as this slide that you're looking at right now, I will just say that employee experience, hands down, is the buzz phrase for 2018. I have a slide which dimensionalizes employee experience, and more specifically, how do you know when you're delivering a superior employee experience, what it's all about. But for now, let's just recognize that compensation is, of course, a major element in the employee experience and employer value proposition to employees. Of course, we use comp to attract, retain, motivate, etc. I'll mention productivity because even very modest upticks in productivity can translate into millions of incremental value for an organization. Just do the math yourself. Take revenue per employee, bring it up by 3 to 5%, multiplied by the size of the workforce, and you'll usually get to millions in incremental value. Comp should also be used to reward behaviors and values, which are the underpinnings of a corporate culture. And finally, organizational agility, which I personally define as the ability to be out in front of both business risks and business opportunities, largely a function of competencies and attitude, and comp influences both. Go to the next slide. You know, when I started in HR, and I'm sure there may be some other, let's say, vintage HR folks out there, remember this as you may remember this as well. We often segmented the workforce for the purpose of delivering differentiated programs, talent management strategies at the segment level. And we often did this just by distinguishing exempt from non-exempt. Perhaps we thought we were really on our game when we did that, but as the saying goes, we've come a long way. And even in the last few years, we've seen a gradual transition from talent segment-based HCM, for example, high potentials, a diversity segment, CEO direct reports segment, to person-based human capital management. We're probably not there yet in most organizations principally due to scalability concerns, for example, but we will get there very soon. Total compensation and talent management competitiveness demands it. So remember, in regards to talent competitiveness, one, very tight labor market given low unemployment. Two, we all know the difference between an average employee and a top performing employee in terms of impact on a business. Three, some traditional sources of talent are not as robust as they used to be. For example, bringing in folks on a work visa, or more people wanting to take a crack at an entrepreneurial venture out there now. So the sources are drying up to some extent. On the next slide, we segue to how compensation management strategies have evolved and are evolving. So from the universally recognized comp management building block, per se, of linking pay to performance, which I believe is being recast as pay for value and pay for contribution, to broadening the notion of compensation to cover both fixed and variable comp, such as different bonuses and even long-term incentive plans, to then broadening the notion of total comp further to include all types of benefits, all types of rewards offered to the employee. So where we are today, which arguably is more about the total relationship than it's about, let's say, total rewards. What do I mean by that? What are the sources of value an employer and employee are providing to each other? Is the employer supporting career goals and aspirations? Is the employee mentoring or contributing in other ways that are outside the confines of their job? Go to the next slide. So let me share with you a framework I came up with, maybe look at it as a lens for organizations to use to assess the degree to which they are delivering a superior employee experience. Why is that important? Because a superior employee experience is necessary for a superior customer experience. Your customer experience is only as good as your employee experience. And when you have a superior employee experience in your organization, when you're delivering that, you're going to be driving engagement, retention, productivity, and at a macro level, organizational agility. And I defined that earlier as ability to be out in front of both business risks and opportunities. So as you can see, there's 4 pillars in my framework. Basically, we start with intrinsic needs. Intrinsic needs. Every single person presumably has an intrinsic need to do meaningful work, to feel valued, to be productive, to be healthy. Secondly, line of sight into career growth, how the company is supporting it. Third is fairness, the fairness principle. We could relate this to compensation equity, for example. But when I talk fairness, I'm talking about it on different levels. How the person's evaluated, how they perceive they're being evaluated, whether there's fairness in that mix, how they're being compensated, how they're being invested in overall. And finally, a phrase that we're seeing more and more of these days, a decluttered work experience with respect to all the systems, the tools, the communication channels, et cetera. So that's my employee experience. You can read more about it in my analyst perspective on the Ventana website. Next. So one more slide for context. This is what a CHRO I reported to twice in my early career, 2 different banks, had to say about the best way to motivate employees, right? Ed Weinmeyer. He's now retired, living in Florida like I am. So notice the emphasis Ed places on intrinsic needs and motivators and the likely influence Ed had on pillar 1 in my framework. So examples of these linkages include, let's say, supporting employees with gaining more autonomy in their job, developing expertise, perhaps having the time, resources, and ability to create an impact that they truly care about, even outside the confines of their role. Ed was a master motivator. Just anecdotally, I'll say he was captain of the Princeton football team, a squadron leader in Vietnam, and actually his famous son, Eric, with a K, Weinmeier, was the first totally blind person to climb Mount Everest. You may look him up, find his story fascinating. Next. All right, it's time to look at some relevant research findings. So we'll go to the next slide, and you see on this next slide the results of Ventana asking hundreds of HR and comp leaders, what do you see as the main benefits of compensation management, and what digital technologies seem to be the most helpful in your comp management practice and processes? So what do we see here? We see improved efficiency, no surprise, gain full value from the investment. Again, no surprise. Visibility into performance, interesting one. You have the compensation equality as distinct from equity, often confused. I view equity more as a fairness kind of theme, and compensation equality more as compensating people equally that are doing very similar jobs with similar backgrounds, similar responsibilities in their portfolio, particularly compensation people equally across genders and other protected groups. And what are the digital technologies that were relevant when we surveyed folks last year? Business analytics, mobile, cloud. Again, nothing revelatory here. Big data found its way onto the list. But I think we'll find some interesting things as our in-progress benchmark research this year in total compensation management is out there collecting data. And we'll be publishing this study in early 2019. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see, again, not based on empirical research because it's in progress, but based on lots of interactions that I have and that my colleagues at Ventana Research have with end users and buyers. This is what we're expecting to see in terms of how this will be recalibrated and some of these themes reshuffled. I do expect to see personalization and the employee experience theme come more to the fore. Those two themes relate to each other. We'll still see the staples like maximize ROI and total rewards. I think we'll see a bit more attention being given to transitioning fixed income dollars like salary dollars to variable dollars, such as bonus and long-term incentive. And we'll see things like enhanced decision making. On the enabling technology side, yes, we'll see business analytics. I think we'll also see the distinction between business analytics and predictive, if not prescriptive analytics, which is predicting and then prescribing what to do about what you're predicting. AI is everywhere, everyone we talk to, everything we read, and we will definitely see AI surface in our benchmark research. We're pretty confident we're going to see that popping up as a top 5 theme. Why? Because in the last year or 18 months, many of the larger HR tech vendors and niche vendors are leveraging now and infusing their products with AI. And we'll talk in a minute about what some of the use cases are that we're seeing and we'll continue to see. And of course, chatbots, some of which are infused with AI as well. Next. Okay. So in terms of what often gets in the way in terms of organizations benefiting from compensation management and some of the enabling technologies, what do we see here? No surprises, scattered data, systems that don't talk to each other, so to speak, also creating redundant and inconsistent views of data when it's scattered and when you have multiple sources of data, an inability to understand what total comp is comprised of. You see the percentages on the right. Around 40% were challenged in this regard. How do you define total comp? What are its elements? How do we put it all together and tell a story in our comp communications? The scary one to me is that given how important comp management is and the investment being made in total compensation and total rewards, 2/3 of respondents last year said that they lack an adequate system for effective comp planning. My take here is that many of today's systems are more helpful with comp administration than comp planning. I'm seeing some signs that that's changing and more organizations are demanding comp planning capability. But again, I'd say for the most part, as a general statement, compensation technology has largely focused on the administrative function, getting all data in one place, reporting, decision support. The planning element is really just kind of coming into its own now in terms of some of these capabilities. We'll get to some of them in a minute. And finally, a few other research tidbits on the next slide. You see two of them. Harkening back to, quote, scattered data across multiple systems, end quote. You can see the quantification of that here with more than 3 sources of data being consulted by almost half the companies in our study. And with all the companies that use spreadsheets to counter issues like lack of trust in data or the need to aggregate data from different sources, 1/3 of companies are using spreadsheets. And they're using them even though a fairly high percentage of those companies have experienced some incident where they've paid people incorrectly, I should say, when they're passing data to their payroll department. Seems like a pretty kind of a head scratcher, I would say, because they are aware that they are paying people incorrectly, and there's no limits to paying somebody incorrectly. You can get into some pretty big numbers there, but yet they still rely on their spreadsheets, evidently. And the next slide. Comp equality, and Tom, I'm going to call on you in a minute here, but so my last research finding relates to compensation equality, which is a bit different than comp equity, and I already mentioned that, but as a kind of a quick refresher, comp equity really relates to fairness, as in that plank from my employee experience framework, in offering and delivering comp programs and how comp levels are established. And the latter, comp equality, deals with paying people in the same type of roles equally, irrespective, of course, of gender. Bottom line takeaway from me here, majority of organizations can be doing better here, period. And with that, I'm going to call on my colleague from PeopleFluent, Tom Sykes. And Tom, I would like to ask you to share with the audience here, you and I have talked a bit about the importance of pay equity within the comp process. Can you possibly share some of the tools or processes that you've seen with your clients that assist in this area of compensation equality?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you and I have discussed this on several occasions, Steve. And I think that, what's interesting to me is that the kinds of practices that we've seen with our customers really align quite a bit in terms of your research. You talk about things like disparate systems and lack of visibility, and obviously, needing solutions in terms of compensation planning. And so I think the most common, or I guess the best advice we could give is that, number one, it starts with data. So being able to have a mechanism in place, even though your source systems may be housing compensation information in disparate places, there's an opportunity to centralize that when it gets to the decision-making process. And as a first step, consolidating that information and making it available. And then number two, being able to provide what we would call practical or digestible analytics. You can actually, if you've got that set of information as a compensation team, it's not too hard to be able to put together a set of metrics that might be made available to managers when they're actually partaking in the planning process. And those are two very common aspects that we see. And then what's gotten a little bit more attention lately is just that it's one thing to provide data and information, but then also to ensure the comprehension around that. So ensuring that there's a really robust communication strategy, that's supported by technology, that's in place, since this is a process that managers tend to engage in on a periodic basis. It's not really a day-to-day kind of thing. So, just making sure there's an avenue to be able to educate and coach managers on both the planning and decisioning process, as well as the conversation or communication they might want to have with employees. So it's not all just about numbers in a vacuum, but being able to interpret the information that you're looking at, and then also being able to provide that same kind of context to the employees at the other end.
Tom, that was really great and insightful, and I could tell that I think you've been doing this a while, and the emphasis on communications and taking the data and making it actionable in the decision process. I think we can't emphasize that enough. So thanks a lot for that, and I'll come back to you in a little bit.
Okay, Steve.
So next slide. What I'd like to do is cover a couple of key themes and trends, and we'll get to those now. So the first one I want to highlight is non-monetary rewards or non-financial rewards, and the role that non-monetary or non-financial rewards is going to be playing in the comp management function going forward. So this is my forecast or assertion in Ventana research terms by 2020. And so in 2 years' time, and actually a little over 1 year's time, at least a third of all organizations using compensation technology or communication tools are going to insist that those tools and platforms track the value and cost of non-monetary rewards. Let me give you some examples. Next slide. Rewards get creative. We'll keep going here so we can get to the examples. And they include ability to telecommute, more and more popular, right? Trade salary dollars for more free time or PTO, probably less than 10% of all mid and large size organizations are allowing this today. We predict this is going to certainly exceed 10% in the next couple of years. Again, almost zero unemployment, other challenges with respect to being able to successfully recruit top talent in the market, engaging passives, those candidates that are not looking for a job. This is, for example, the ability to trade salary dollars for more free time or PTO certainly is going to appeal to a segment of the top talent pool out there and the passive talent pool that's not necessarily looking for a job. Opportunity to accelerate career growth via job rotation and overseas assignment. This has some personal significance to me and meaning to me. Earlier in my career, 15 years ago, I took an overseas assignment mostly to get exposed to other cultures, other countries, and kind of what it means to be a global HR professional. Flexibility to have longer paid maternity. The one data point, and it's been publicized recently by Google, is that when they increased their policy of providing paid maternity and paternity leave, and they increased it by, I think, 50%, they saw a pronounced increase in the percentages of those employees that were on leave coming back to work. So for them, it was a business case and an ROI that proved out when they enriched their paid maternity policy. Be assigned a career coach or an executive coach, not just for executives, which is more of a typical dynamic you see, particularly like in Silicon Valley and Fortune 50 companies. Most of the executives now might have an internal or outside coach, but bringing that down into the organization for mid-managers who you could argue may need coaching more than senior executives. Count community volunteer work toward your work week, giving back, civic pride, being a good citizen, more important to companies, more important to a lot of employees now. So this is, maybe a representative sample just to show you how broad and diverse and creative these non-financial rewards can get. Next slide. Let me give you a couple of industry examples, actually workforce segment examples, if you will, non-financial rewards. Just wanted to put this together to be even more clear about this. So for top performers in an hourly dominated industry like retail, hospitality, casual dining, where, as we all know, turnover tends to be very high. One of the causal factors is unpredictable work schedules, onerous work schedules. So for top performers, make sure from a process and technology standpoint that you're giving them more predictable work schedules. Tuition reimbursement, even for hourlies. A career coach, even for your top performing hourlies. And conversion to salary, which is what most of them that are committed to that company and that role are thinking about. On the professional side, whether it be consulting, IT, financial services, engineering, let them select their projects, select their clients, pick from among certain long-term incentive plans, offer a project completion bonus. Again, these are just, again, examples of what we're talking about in terms of being creative, in this case, for certain workforce segments. Next. All right, my second theme, we just talked about non-financial and non-monetary rewards. For me, probably the number one theme that I'm pretty focused on these days is personalizing rewards, and more broadly, personalization in the HCM realm. So the next slide, why personalize? Why do it? Why personalize total rewards or total comp? Well, if you really want to optimize the employee experience, where both employer and employee are deriving maximum value from the relationship, because that's when the good stuff happens, personalizing rewards is a key way to get there. And if you don't consider this important, just keep in mind that your employees, whether it be in social media or with their friends, they're just seeing more evidence of this personalization dynamic in other organizations, in the way they recruit, in the way they retain, in the way they motivate, etc. And in the market in general. So it's probably something to include in your discussions about being competitive in the war for talent. Talent competitiveness must, let's say, be connected heavily to this personalization theme. Next slide. And isn't it pretty ironic that we're hearing and seeing some of the early use cases around AI's ability to help personalize things like onboarding or learning or coaching to make those activities more effective, but comp and total rewards, where arguably the greatest ROI can be achieved given all the investment that is rolled into the comp function. And when you think about the greatest ROI that can be achieved from personalizing compensation, comp has generally lagged the other areas. My sense is that this again relates to the ability to scale, particularly when you consider all of the potential types of rewards that exist today, right? Including non-financial rewards. Finally, it's definitely not enough just to personalize comp. You need to be effective in, as Tom said earlier, communicating around the process as well, or you compromise potential ROI. And our research tells us that around half of organizations still don't believe comp communications is that important. Frankly, this is astonishing. Well, I guess every company can't be a leader in their market segment. Next. I think this slide speaks for itself. Note the title, Personalization Starts with the Job Posting. This creative job posting is emphasizing that this employer is committed to finding out what is important to each prospective employee versus making assumptions or relying on generalizations. Avoiding sweeping generalizations is pretty important because while 70% of early career employees may want a higher salary to deal with a mortgage payment on their first house or a student loan repayment, or maybe 70% of Gen Xers who followed baby boomers, many of them who entered a slow job market with a mountain of credit card debt, maybe they prefer a larger bonus to make lump sum payments to pay down the credit cards, or maybe 70% of baby boomers might be more apt to think about retirement, 401k, and work-life balance and other non-financial rewards. You still have the other 30% that generalized compensation strategies won't be a good fit for. Next slide. Okay, so let's spend some time getting acquainted with Jill, James, and Tom. And for the record, this is not Tom Sykes. 3 business analysts in the same division of a particular company that's in a position to personalize traditional forms of compensation. It's year end. They all just had their focal review, a performance, comp, and career discussion. To try to keep things a little simple, they were all at $80K base salary going into the discussion, but they all came out of the discussion with a different base going into next year. And yet, this organization has no real concerns about comp equity or comp equality. Why is that? Well, these employees were offered an opportunity to personalize their total compensation between salary, bonus, or short-term incentive, and equity or long-term incentive. Specifically, as you see in the slide, They could trade salary dollars for additional short-term incentives / cash bonus dollars, which is the route that Tom took. Perhaps Tom has short-term cash needs, or trade salary dollars for more equity, as Jill did. Perhaps Jill can tolerate more risk in her asset portfolio, but she's also bullish on the company's stock. By way of contrast, the conservative and formally dressed James said, hey, I'll stay the course. So in this scenario, what am I trying to do? This organization is taking into account what is typically paid out on bonus targets. You need some analytics capability for that, of course. And they're accounting for uncertainty in the, quote, salary for bonus dollars exchange, quote, by valuing salary dollars a bit higher than bonus dollars. And they are accounting for both the uncertainty, but also the upside potential of a larger equity award when they incentivize employees to trade salary dollars for equity as well. So, bottom line, in this little vignette, this organization personalized traditional compensation options, likely bought incremental employee loyalty, engagement, and retention, and in the process, more effectively aligned total comp with both employee and company performance. Next. So here's my personalized comp blueprint as I see it, and the risk of oversimplifying. Remember, to be talent competitive and attract and retain the best, you have to get personal, including with respect to rewards preferences. Keep in mind those preferences are going to change over time. They almost always do. And see if it's all worth it, i.e. all the effort and investment to personalize, including the extra management time that'll be needed. In other words, evaluate ROI, evaluate impact. We suspect it'll be worth it for the vast majority of organizations that are going to be endeavoring to personalize total rewards. Next. So it's not going to get into this very complicated slide, but just say that those personalization flavors are also depicted here with potential long-term incentive plans. You see something like phantom stock where it belongs actually, because it is in effect a cash award based on stock appreciation over time. Hence, a long-term incentive reward at its essence. One takeaway: in the age of the employee experience and the mandate, and this compelling notion of delivering the superior employee experience, the employee needs and preferences must factor into the long-term incentive plans that are being offered, not just factored into company interests and goals, but employee interests and goals as well. Next slide. Okay, digital technologies take over. Let's have a look. I think you're going to enjoy this part of the discussion. I'm going to provide some use cases around compensation in relation to these new emerging digital technologies. So here's my handy-dandy rendition of the new HR Power Tool six-pack. We know that most of these digital advances weren't even around or talked about within HR circles as recently as 18 months ago. Well, that's changed, especially with AI and bots, some of which are AI-infused bots. But quickly, for the less familiar, the six-pack includes, and I'll give, like I said, some comp-specific use cases for these, RPA, robotic process automation. Here's the use case. RPA, as one use case, can be used to crunch numbers, perform analyses from departments, departmental bonus submissions, departmental salary increases that are being suggested or recommended. RPA is great at crunching. As long as the business rules are well-defined, you can crunch numbers more accurately, much more quickly than humans can. AI and machine learning, and I'm going to kind of dimensionalize AI into some use case categories, which I think will be useful for you to see. But as an example of a use case, personalization. Personalize total rewards package, modify it as new data presents itself. New data on the company, on the role, on the individual, on the market. Virtual agents and bots can provide info to managers, answer their questions quickly, particularly if they're routine questions. What about, here's an example. A manager asks their digital assistant, my top employee just told me that they got a competitive offer that's 20% higher. What are my options? If that can be transcribed and recorded in the company kind of repository of answers to typical questions that can certainly power that conversation with the digital assistant. Predictive analytics, you can predict fallout from cutting a salary increase budget, for example, or a bonus pool budget. Virtual reality usually refers to simulations. So simulation in the world of comp, understand employee potential better through work simulations. Potential should be factored into comp if at all possible. Finally, Internet of Things, IoT, usually deals with sensors and sensors communicating data and information to a system or network, to the Internet. So IoT in the world of comp, factor procedural compliance in the field. For field workers, they're on a construction site. They're working for a cable company and installing, cable TV. Well, factor in procedural compliance into their performance, which, of course, is an input to comp. Next. And so, you're going to have access to a copy of this, but I really do think this is one of the most important slides because AI has become a blur out there. You go to an HR tech show and seemingly every vendor is talking about AI. But beyond what AI means, and it usually relates to some form of simulating the way human cognition works, I break it down into 6 categories of use cases. We talked a lot already about personalization and predictions. That'll branch out into prescriptive actions, what an organization should do about it. And then we're going to start to see more in the next year or two around AI being used to discern sentiments. So we're not talking about kind of crossing the line here and really knowing what somebody's thinking, kind of a big brother sort of paradigm. We're not talking about that. We're talking about keeping a pulse on the organization in the aggregate. Maybe we just changed our benefit plan. Maybe we did cut back on bonuses and we're asking people to switch over to longer term incentives. Well, based on discussion boards, based on in the aggregate, what words that are coming up in emails, AI can be used to discern sentiments. AI can also be used to discern intentions in an exchange and interaction with a bot, discern relationships. Who influences whom? Why is that important? Well, in a change management context, who influences whom is quite important. And curation. Curation applies to many different things. Curating experts, curating knowledge, information, curating tools, systems. So these are my 6 categories of where I am seeing pretty much every use case out there in AI is falling into one or more of these categories. Next. And then I'm going to call on Tom in a second, but when again, in terms of analytics, the last certainly not an inconsequential theme is analytics, viewed as the most important digital type of technology for compensation management by the vast majority of orgs that responded to Ventana Research's benchmark research on total comp, 83%. And with that, I'm going to ask Tom to join again and say, Tom, let me ask, what are some of the expectations your customers have in relation to some of these new digital technologies? And for example, using them to improve the comp process, but also the flip side, what are some of their apprehensions around these emerging technologies, if you could share that?
Sure, yeah. It's a really good question, Steve. Because, for us, for myself as a technologist, the advent of these kinds of new tools, this is something we're always looking for, the place where this can intersect with the challenges or the opportunities that our customers are facing. And then, you mentioned before, you got an HR technology show and everybody's espousing their great AI capabilities. So I think that there's a definite skepticism out there. And we're, I think our customers are looking for, to us, to a certain extent, to offer some kind of practical use cases, and there are some things, as people get more educated and start to understand sort of the sheer size of data set required to properly train an AI. That's sort of one area where, I don't know that people are looking for an AI to provide them with the optimized allocation of a budget pool or something like that from an incentive process. I don't think that they're looking to delegate decision making away from line managers making decisions about people, to some kind of black box or something like that. But definitely, I think there's a lot of credence in things like some of these, the salary survey benchmark aggregators. I think there's a lot that could be done there because of the size of the data sets they work with. I think there's an opportunity for, like you said, from an analytics standpoint, the idea that rather than looking to the comp department to maybe pose the questions and determine how they want to disseminate that information, that different kinds of questions could be tested and answered through something like artificial intelligence to see if you could glean, risk factors of disparate impact or something along those lines. And then you're talking a lot about sort of natural language processing technology, virtual agents that might be able to guide individuals either through, instruction on how to do something procedurally, or again, assist with the communication process. I think there's a big productivity gain that's got some potential when we talk about things like bots and virtual agents.
No, there's a lot there.
There's definitely a lot there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Tom. I would add to that just in terms of concern or possibly an apprehension that some of the end users and buyers have that I've spoken with. They bring up a notion that I refer to as the consequences of being wrong. And when you're relying on a machine to direct you or, for the most part, really help you make a decision, whether it's hiring somebody or who should be working with whom and what teams, composition of teams is going to be the best, or as it relates to compensation, what should we be paying relative to market? Should we be at the 80th percentile or the 120th percentile based on how our bookings look as a company? What are the consequences of being wrong? That could be all over the map. And I would say, again, if the benefit is demonstrable to the organization and the consequences of being wrong, if you rely too heavily on AI, are not so material, then I think that's where you're getting to kind of an ideal situation. Heavy impact, consequences of AI being wrong, not extremely material and significant. So I'll just add that to the mix. And thanks, Tom. Thanks again. So next slide. Wanted to give you some, and we could paint out this slide here. It's in build mode, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to share with you, when as we said at the beginning, I was involved in the compensation function in several banks in the 80s and 90s, and I think we just went too far. Yeah. So some of the interesting analytics examples that my teams came up with. The first one actually relates even more to today's world, where you can have, quote, digital era jobs that there's no analog for, there's no benchmark for in the market. So an interesting one, and there's, I don't know, to pick a number, probably 5 to 7 or 8% of all jobs that you're going to find in a large organization these days were not jobs that existed as recently as 2 years ago. So what do? Well, first you want to kind of take stock and figure out what's the percentage of jobs that are not covered by market data? What do we do about that? Do we have to take an amalgamation of different surveys? Do we have to infer what the market data would look like? Do we need to combine job codes to form a different type of kind of internal benchmark? Number of high potential successor candidates or other types of key employees who are flight risks or are reporting to flight risks definitely relates to compensation, as does when you look at that relationship between performance and comp. Well, you could have a real anomalous situation where performance is going one way, comp is going the other. I remember back in the 80s, I was at Payne Webber, and the chairman of Payne Webber was very interested in this one. Percentage of employees choosing different rewards options by talent segment helps in the personalization process, and more specifically, helps you scale that personalization process when you can have a head start and have some intel and visibility into which talent segments are preferring which types of rewards. Finally, percentage of bonus pool that's being allocated to some of those key segments, high potentials, critical roles. And by the way, a critical role, as distinct from a key employee, right? A key employee doesn't have to be in one of the top 3 or 4 levels of the organization. A key employee can be the only person in the organization that really knows a legacy system that is feeding or receiving data from many other enterprise systems. That person, by definition, becomes a key employee. Scarce, it's a mouthful, skill set jobs, are they trending up or down? So these are some of the interesting analytics examples that I think should be considered here, and they all relate to comp. Next. All right, in terms of recommendation, let me go straight to business case, right? So, and then we're going to take some questions. So what are some of the staples I've seen and helped on the, when I had my consulting hat on, some of the staples: reduce financial errors when you have a good compensation platform that's reliable and your data is not scattered across multiple disparate systems, linking pay with performance, having a meritocracy, both performance of the individual and the company, less time manipulating and validating data within your compensation process. Those were some of the historical staples. They're still there today, should be part of a business case. And they include I would include the amount of time that line managers are spending playing around with spreadsheets, maybe because they don't trust the data, because the data is spread out over multiple systems, and they don't trust the processes that are behind managing that data and certifying that data. All the time that's being spent on spreadsheets is probably high cost types of time when it's line managers that are spending that time. All right, new additions to the business case: employee engagement, satisfaction, and retention. Now that not just surveys are measuring that, traditional surveys, but post surveys and sentiment analysis tools, right, are being used to look at engagement and keep tabs on engagement satisfaction. Of course, retention is a pretty straightforward metric. And if to the extent that you are getting upticks in those, presumably by doing things like personalizing comp, that should clearly be part of the business case. Greater success in recruiting top talent because you've gotten creative with your levers, with your compensation levers. Predict the impact of changing compensation guidelines or plans before you change the plan and have potentially some negative fallout from it. That was the third point here that I think was not painted on the screen, is predicting impact of changing comp guidelines or plans. You don't want people to leave and then go back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that. All right, so I think with that, my last slide here, the to-do list, to recap it all. Evaluate your rewards portfolio, your total rewards portfolio. The operative word there is total, talking about traditional, non-traditional, and non-financial rewards to the extent that you can quantify. Cost and return would be great. And evaluate the portfolio through this employee experience lens. Is this the portfolio we need to attract and retain the best and motivate them and get them to the highest levels of productivity and loyalty to the company? Again, for me, delivering a superior employee experience is the point of intersection where both employer and employee are deriving maximum value from the relationship. Improve or broaden compensation offerings as needed. Prioritize actions, factoring in ROI, risk, reward. And then when I say objectively assess capabilities, I'm talking about typically technology capabilities versus needs. But it's not just technology capabilities. It's competencies. What competencies do we need? What type of staffing level do we need to take advantage of some of these very powerful emerging technologies versus what do we have? So it's a simple, what do we have versus what do we need? That's the to-do list. And I think with that, we do have, 5 minutes or so for some questions. Rachel, if we could turn it back to you.
Sure, yes. We had a question come in. You just mentioned this before. What skills or competencies does a compensation management leader need today that they didn't really need a few years ago?
Yeah, thanks. I did touch upon it a little bit, but let me elaborate further. Thanks for that, and whoever sent that. So off the top of my head, I would say there's a need for comp professionals and anybody in HR at a professional level to think and behave more like a data scientist than as a consumer of information. The best way I have, kind of anecdotally, to highlight what I'm talking about here is, again, one of my former bosses years ago, a CHRO, used to say to me when I bring him a report or bring him some data that I was excited about sharing, he'd say, Steve, I have questions for all your answers. And that's the best way that I can kind of underscore what it's like to think and act and behave like a data scientist. Professionals have to do more of this. What else came up?
Another question that came up. What is an example of a comp practice that has worked for a company's short-term interests but has not worked for their longer-term interests?
Yeah, good one. Well, I had a personal experience with this many years ago when I was doing consulting, and the firm that I was a boutique firm with 200 consultants, so not too boutique-ish, but 200. And we had a compensation practice which basically rewarded consultants that were billing the most, which is kind of a, it's a double-edged sword because, you're going to probably improve profitability and revenue in the short run. But in the long run, if the customer and client is not seeing value in the incremental hours being billed to them, you're going to potentially lose those customers or inevitably lose those customers. So the compensable factors in a bonus plan should be looking at it from different angles, not just from the angle of, in this case, a consulting firm generating as much revenue as possible, if that makes sense.
Great. Another question that came in, which digital technology do you think customers will get the most value out of the fastest?
Well, it's an easy one for me, and maybe Tom has some perspective on this too, but I would say if I separate those two between value and time to value, the value side, clearly it's going to be AI and some of those use cases I talked about related to personalization, predictive, prescriptive, et cetera. But in terms of time to value, that's the caveat here, because these machines have to be trained with training data, and that takes time. So in terms of the timeline, I would say bots should be rolled out, if they're not already being rolled out in your organization, to answer those routine, predictable questions. And it could absolutely free up HR and compensation teams and allow them to do more strategic and high-value work.
Yeah, Steve, I think I'd echo that to a certain extent, in terms of, how rapidly you can start to glean value from some of these digital technologies. And I don't even know if I'd call digital just next generation or anything like that. But in that same theme, I'd say that we've seen definitely amongst our customer base a lot of energy just put into this notion of kind of communication and understanding and openness and transparency. Because there generally is a lot of thought put into the compensation philosophies at a given organization and the way all those things roll out. And so the better understanding employees have, the more impactful that could definitely be. And there's a lot of avenues towards trying to bring that education to the masses.
Yeah, good stuff. Anything else come in, Rachel?
Yep. One final question. In your opinion, how many organizations have you seen, or maybe you haven't seen any, that have begun adopting some of these new digital technologies?
It's interesting. Last year, less than a year ago, I ran a panel. It was a virtual HR executive roundtable. Had about 20 organizations, most of them pretty well-known organizations, HR leaders participate. And I was asking them that question, where are they already deploying some of these, as Tom says, next generation technologies? And I was surprised to hear that that RPA, robotic process automation, seemed to be the one digital technology that was really being relied on and in production and being used pretty heavily in many of these organizations. And again, as long as you could define the rules with which you are aggregating data, certifying data, crunching, doing calculations with data, machines can do it much more quickly and much more accurately, and that it's kind of unlimited, all the different use cases that you would have for performing those sort of manipulations with data. I think if I ran that same panel this year, and I think I will be doing one of them soon, I think we'll start to see some examples of personalization, and certainly even more examples of predictive use cases like predicting retention risk and that sort of thing.
Great. And one final question just came in as well. When we allow employees to personalize their total comp mix, what if most of the employees choose a high portion of fixed pay? What kind of happens, with like how does the variable pay concept help striving employees, to perform better? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. Off the top of my head, I would say they're going to have to sweeten the pot on the alternative compensation element in this case, whether it be, some type of longer-term hook, longer-term incentive, cash or equity-based. They're just going to have to sweeten the pot on that because it's, I do believe in every organization's best interest to move as much of those fixed pay dollars into the, performance-based variable comp pool. So they're just going to have to sweeten the pot on the variable side would be my suggestion.
Great. And that is all the questions we have.
Excellent. Well, thanks for moderating, Rachel. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure as always.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.